Welcome and thank you to Aysam Faris Institute, Nasser Yassin in particular, as well as Alum and the LSE Institute for Global Affairs, partners for this really great initiative and gathering. I am Charlotte Karam. I am the Associate Dean of Programs at the Olayan School of Business, and I'm honored to have you here at our business school in Ma'amari Auditorium. Being included in this conference and organizing a panel on business's role is significant for us here at OSB for a whole host of reasons, not least of which is that we draw great pride and passion in being anchored in our community and in working to suggest solutions to the plights of our community. We recognize and we embrace our responsibility to be a part of the solution and to critically reflect on ways forward. We draw on the entrepreneurial courage of Sulaiman S. Olayan, for whom our school is named, who had a great perspective on community service and on leaving a legacy of positive impact and a commitment to good. Aligned with this, I would like to welcome you to today's roundtable, the constructive role of business initiatives and scholarships in the refugee crisis. I would like my slides to be put up too, please. Thank you. Just give it a moment. Here, I can do it. I can do it, it's okay. Thank you. So we welcome you and hope further that this opens the door to inspire constructive conversations on how business schools, business and management scholarship, and of course private sector actors can work towards partnerships to tackle the humanitarian and socioeconomic crisis that faces us globally. As wisely stated by UNHCR's representative Mireille Girard in one of yesterday's panels, private sector and business schools are untapped resources for refugee crisis response. So please, I invite you today as representatives of governments, aid agencies, NGOs, nonprofit organizations, civil society actors, and scholars from across various disciplines to think about ways to work with business. Through our roundtable discussion today, we hope to inspire potential for partnerships geared toward tackling humanitarian problems intertwined with migration and the refugee crisis in Lebanon, the region, and beyond. All this said, and on the one hand, possibilities for a positive and constructive role of business is one perspective, and certainly ours here today on this panel. But on the other hand, there are, of course, other perspectives. We are aware that businesses don't have the best reputation as ethical, sustainable, responsible conduct. Indeed, many of you probably agree with the sentiment that's in this cartoon here today. I hear some laughs, not enough laughs, though. So I guess it really does resonate quite well. We recognize this. We are aware that businesses don't have this best reputation, however, we as scholars, as practitioners, as entrepreneurs, businessmen and women who work actively and think critically on the possibilities for more constructive roles going forward. We're here today to think about possibilities for business paradigms allowing for more sustainable futures, allowing for positive change, and allowing for partnerships. Our group of roundtable speakers are great examples of this. Our panelists were asked to think about the following questions within the context of the conference here today and yesterday, within the context of the refugee crisis. How can businesses better mobilize and organize capacity to build momentum toward more efficient and effective solution-oriented initiatives? What are the potential mechanisms to facilitate businesses' ability to foster innovation and find sustainable solutions to problems in the current crises? And what public role do business and management scholars have in advocating the interests of non-shareholder stakeholders through advocacy, through teaching, and through scholarship? Broadly conceived, this panel explores the role of business and business management scholarship in responding to the refugee crisis. We hope to highlight and present a number of powerful ways through which business initiatives and scholarships can play a constructive role in responding. With that, with that brief introduction, I turn to our first speaker, Dr. Nadim Munla, Special Advisor. We debated how to say this line. Special Advisor to the Prime Minister, except for yesterday and moving forward, we'll see what will happen. So with that, please, Dr. Munla. Yes, absolutely.
Well, I guess, good afternoon, everyone, first. I guess I have three challenges. One, to counter the sugar in your blood after the lunch and the dessert, and that's a challenge. Two, I have to convince you to concentrate on the subject rather than about the political situation in Lebanon these days, and it's not easy. And three, to talk about one of the most difficult issues that Lebanon is facing and has been facing for the last few years. And obviously, I'm referring to the Syrian refugee crisis in Lebanon. Obviously, the crisis has many facets, many dimensions, from humanitarian to social tension to economic. And what I would like to concentrate on is employment. And is there a way where we can come up with a solution? It's a win-win solution where we can turn the crisis into an opportunity. And it's not easy, but over the last few months, there has been a lot of effort that went into the construction of a plan that will provide an opportunity for both Lebanese and Syrians to generate employment or to create employment opportunities for both of them. And this has really started when the crisis situation went into 7th year. Everybody is recognizing that the humanitarian dimension is only one dimension and that we have to go into a more serious effort to create better living conditions for the refugees. That also created a crisis among Lebanese, and many have felt that the Syrians are accepting lower wages and taking the jobs of the Lebanese. So what is the plan that could be a win-win situation? Now, some figures is that, to remind you, during peak years in the 90s, during the reconstruction of Lebanon, we had very close to 1 million Syrians working in infrastructure. Regularly, we have between 300 to 500,000. So Lebanon, the labor market is used to that. But what we have come up with is the following. For the last 12 years, Lebanon did not spend any money on its infrastructure. The infrastructure we have is really built for 3 million people. We are 4 to 4.5, with about an additional 1.5 to 2 million refugees, Syrian and otherwise. Now the infrastructure is in a very bad condition, physically and in terms of capacity to accommodate and to service about 6 million people. So the plan was, can we design an infrastructural investment plan that can do two things: enhance the existing infrastructure for the Lebanese and at the same time create jobs? We came up with a plan that was the subject of political debate in the last 2-3 weeks, and this is a plan for $16 billion in infrastructure between in the coming 8 to 10 years. And this covers, I will tell you, what sectors: transport, broadly defined to include roads, airports, ports; water supply, wastewater, electricity, telecom, solid waste, health, education, and culture. So the total plan was $16 billion. To give you an idea what that implies in terms of generating employment, every $1 billion spent on infrastructure creates 50,000 jobs. And that's no other sector, no other productive sector can create that amount. Now, given that there are 500,000 vulnerable Lebanese and Syrians between the ages of 14 and 24, that provides a very golden opportunity for them to find jobs, to improve their livelihoods, and in addition to that, for the Syrians, provide them with the skill and experience that when they go back to their country, they will be able to participate in the reconstruction of Syria. And they will have good memories about Lebanon and what Lebanese have provided them in terms of opportunities and skills. So I would like, at this point, I'm presenting the plan. There are many details in the plan. And the most important is the following question: how would such a plan be financed? The international atmosphere nowadays is very conducive for that, simply because no one wants to give grants, but all countries and all institutions are willing to give money to fund projects. So it's a very conducive environment. At the same time, we are at a world in a record low interest rate. So we can borrow at 1 to 1.5% for 3 years and 10 years grace period. That kind of funding and financing will not put a lot of burden on our debt and debt profile and debt servicing. So this is in a nutshell how, by using the investment in infrastructure, we can create from this crisis an opportunity for both Lebanese and Syrians. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Munla. We open up questions from the panel.
Dr. Munla, so you spoke about the financing and you probably addressed it from, you know, kind of getting the money or getting loans. But meaning the international communities are today kind of helping refugees, and because we are creating a project that might create opportunities for refugees, did we try or did we find any reaction from the international organization to be supportive on helping with these projects instead of, you know, taking all the burden on us in the funding thing?
Well, I don't know whether I understood the question correct. Are you saying would they provide us with grants instead of loans? Is that the? No, okay. Just for the record, every $1 million we borrow at 1 to 1.5% for a period of 30 years and grace period of 10 years is equivalent to 65% grant, as if you are returning only 1/3 of the money after 30 years. So there is a built-in concessional aspect or dimension in the structure of the loan.
So the previous session focused on issues related to education and human capital. So thinking about refugees and infrastructure needs, are there opportunities to build human capital among refugees that would be working on these sorts of projects?
Yes, I mean, the government was working seriously on embarking a very ambitious technical and vocational education. And it has been the opinion of the Prime Minister that you would like to teach those kids. We want them to go back to Syria and contribute to the reconstruction of Syria and have very good memories about Lebanon and so that we build a better relations between the two countries in the future. So yes, there is a very ambitious technical and vocational educational program to accompany this.
No? Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Munla. We're going to move to Dr. We have a slide, there we go. Dr. Harry VanBuren, who is the Jack and Donna Russ Professor of Business Ethics at the University of New Mexico.
Thank you, Charlotte. I am honored to be on this distinguished panel addressing the topic of business responses to refugee crises. I came to this area as an extension of work that I am doing in the area of business and human rights. Generally speaking, states are responsible for ensuring that human rights are protected. Businesses have duties to respect human rights in places where they have direct or indirect operations, with joint responsibilities to ensure access to effective judicial and non-judicial remedies when rights are violated. There is significant discussion of what businesses should do in contexts where respect for human rights is weak and governmental institutions are effective or corrupt. A similar analysis, I think, applies to refugee crises. I would like to outline 3 ways in which businesses can respond to refugee crises. The first is through philanthropy. There is a long record of businesses giving money and goods to local communities that are experiencing crises and disasters. Now, I don't want to downplay the role of philanthropy and charitable contributions, which are important in giving direct resources to people in need. But philanthropy is ancillary to the core purposes of businesses. It's what businesses do in their day-to-day activities that really matter, and it's in those operations where businesses are having their most significant effects on stakeholders, for good or for ill. So here I would like to advocate for a more expansive role for business in responding to refugee crises in 2 ways: cross-sectoral partnerships and labor market activities. There's an extensive literature on cross-sectoral partnerships. Businesses can work with NGOs, civil society organizations, and governments to address social concerns. While this might seem closer to philanthropy, participation in cross-sectoral partnerships is quite different from philanthropy. In cross-sectoral partnerships, businesses contribute various types of resources, but most particularly capabilities already used for business purposes that are then put into service in the cross-sectoral partnership. In short, there is much that businesses can do to work with partners from other sectors to address the problems faced by refugees and refugee communities. These sorts of partnerships are all the more effective and all the more important in contexts where the state is less than effective, which is often but not always the case in home countries. Now, I am aware that many people in government and civil society, or among many people in government and civil society, there is skepticism and even cynicism about business. Now, I'm a business ethicist, so I totally get that. Indeed, my entire field exists because of bad behavior by businesses. I would say, however, in response to that cynicism, that community engagement is being increasingly expected by stakeholders, and businesses in turn are responding through cross-sectoral partnerships and other means of using their capabilities as businesses for social benefit. What I am advocating is a kind of pragmatism. What matters is not what ideology of business-government society relations one holds, but whether in a specific context, a specific business or a group of businesses can collaborate with other sectors to address and alleviate human suffering. In short, refugee crises require all hands on deck, working together. We can't ignore the potential role of business as a force for good in this domain. I now turn to another way in which businesses can respond to refugee crises, and that is through labor markets. And if I could have my slide, please. Now, the picture that's going to be put up is of Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, with Syrian refugees who had been hired to work in the company's stores. Like a number of companies in the United States and Europe, Starbucks has created programs to employ refugees. These programs help with human capital development, particularly language acquisition, where the host country has a dominant language different from the refugees, and social integration, along with the more tangible benefits of income generation. Starbucks also makes higher education free, online higher education free, for all of its employees. In Germany, businesses have worked together to hire refugees for entry-level jobs, providing the training and language classes needed for the refugees to advance their careers. When adult refugees are hired in this way, with attention to their human capital development, their entire families benefit as well. Now, it must be admitted that in many contexts, hiring refugees and being public about doing so is seen as a political act. And so it was for Starbucks in the United States. Being an American, I have seen tweet storms and other forms of outrage. The arguments are familiar to all of us. Why are you helping these people? Why aren't you hiring people from this country? Don't you care about people who are citizens and unemployed? And on and on. But being an American in 2017, I can tell you that tweet storms, while seemingly intense and a big deal to those involved, pass. People move on to other things. Sometimes as a business, the best thing to do is to ignore social media for a bit and to focus on your own values. Now, I want to briefly turn to the role of business schools in refugee crises. When I told my colleagues that I was coming to Beirut to work on this issue, they weren't sure what to think because they hadn't really thought about refugee issues as business issues. And I think part of the problem is that management scholars are like corporate leaders. They focus on the groups most like themselves. It's not that they see and don't care, but rather that they don't see at all, or see and express concern on a human level without engaging in the systematic and institutional analysis needed to address the issue. So what can business scholarship do? First, I think this area provides opportunities to conduct research on cross-sectoral partnerships in highly challenging environments. If we expect businesses to be good citizens and contribute positively to their host communities, and we should, assessing when, how, and how well businesses can respond to refugee crises is a critical research question. In short, we need good data on what works and what doesn't. And I want to conclude with some observations about community and business ethics. Stakeholder analysis is one of the best known concepts in the field of business ethics, and it's being seen more and more in other fields, including public and nonprofit administration. In my own work, I have focused on employee stakeholders. I want to note, however, that communities are the least well understood and theorized in stakeholder analysis in business ethics. We lack good models for understanding the place of business in local communities as a matter of ethical responsibility. Refugee crises place undeniable strains on these communities. Research in business ethics should squarely address how businesses interact with their communities and how they can contribute to addressing crises. Because businesses are not separate from communities and because they're part of communities, businesses need to play a role in responding to refugee crises. And refugee crises pose ethical issues for communities, governments, civil society organizations, and businesses. As a business ethicist, I always want to ask this question: what does it mean to be a good business? In our scholarship, our activism in business practice, this is the critical question to ask with regard to business and refugee crises.
Do we have any questions from the panelists? Comments? Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much. Just I would like to mention a comment which is of relevant information, I think, to everyone, and I forgot to mention it in my presentation. One of the challenges in Lebanon is that the law does not allow the refugees and Syrian refugees to work in all types of businesses, and it's constrained to solid waste management, to agriculture and construction. And that's why there are many limitations to what businesses can do in order to play a bigger role in the context you have mentioned. Thank you.
And I think that's a really good point, is to think about how labor policy and employment regulation joins up with the needs of refugees, how it joins up with training opportunities. My wife and I are working with a couple of Syrian refugees in Albuquerque, and we've seen similar sorts of issues, not in terms of constraining where they can work, but in terms of work permits and other things like that. So there really needs to be interaction between business and government to think about what public policies make sense.
I have a question. So today, without counting the refugees, the unemployment rate in Lebanon for young people is above 33%, if I'm not mistaken, and this is probably a year old. And this is a big challenge, meaning comparing how the US, a country like the US, reacts to embracing refugees and to providing them with employment versus a country like Lebanon that is already suffering without that. And the status of the refugees here, who are refugees that are here to go back versus probably, and I'm not sure, the status in the US, they might probably have become immigrants and not refugees. And this is a big difference. And you know, the two examples are completely different, and this is why I believe today it's a very sensitive subject in Lebanon because we are already suffering without that, and the ratio as well is huge. So this is why that point in particular and the livelihood, in providing them livelihood by providing them with employment beyond what probably Dr. Munla has talked about earlier would be very challenging. This is my point of view on that.
And thank you for that comment. I've been here for the last week, and it's been really, really interesting to see the political context and to think about it in the context of the United States, which of course is my home country, or Germany, where my son is a university student. And I think it is right to point out that in the United States and in Germany, refugees have become immigrants, or so the folks that my wife and I are working with are applying for green cards to have permanent residency. And that is a very significant difference between the United States and Germany and Lebanon. So one of the things that this means, and this was a section I had to cut for time, is that responses of business to refugee crises have to be locally situated. They do have to be sensitive to the local context and to the legitimate concerns of citizens in that country. I think the challenge for a country like Lebanon, where the refugee population is so large relative to the overall population, is how do you foster those sorts of opportunities for human capital advancement and employment while at the same time address the legitimate concerns of citizens, which is certainly no easy task.
Thank you for that. We're just very conscious of the time to move forward, so we're going to move to the next panelists. If I could have the slide of the next panelist, please. Dr. Bashar Assad, who is the director of Darwaza Center and associate professor of business, information and decision systems here at the Olayan School of Business, as well as Dr. Danda Salamoon, who is an assistant professor of information systems here at the business school. I think we're just going for your slide.
When I'm going to stand up. No reflection on neither Nadim nor Hoda. So thank you for having us on the panel. Thank you for Assam Fares Institute to incorporating our basically trying to explain a little bit what we mean, at least on the ground, by some of the things that business can bring to the table. So I really like what Nadim talked about in terms of concrete programs that the Lebanese government is thinking about and trying to actually put into action. I think what Harry talked about is also very important in the sense that you need parameters within which to work with. So more specifically, what they like to kind of give you 3 stories, and based on these 3 stories, let's see what kind of more concrete projects, initiatives, types of things that the business can bring to the table in addressing the refugee crisis. let me see. So this slide shows a rehydration kit called Kit Yamoy. This was designed in the UK for populations at risk because it's a big problem in a lot of areas of the world, but particularly in Africa, to be able to have hydration or rehydration kits delivered to people, and it's more important than food, actually. So the problem that this NGO faced is that they went through a long process developing the actual product, packaging it, making sure it works. Guess what? What is the big problem? Getting it to the population in need. How are you going to get this in some places in Africa? And this took them back to the drawing board because logistics was the biggest challenge, not the product itself, after you've done. So what did they do? After a long process, it turns out places that neither UN go or the government, guess who goes? Can I have the next slide? No? Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola has a long reach into places that a lot of people can get to. So actually, this NGO redesigned the kit to fit within Coca-Cola cartons in partnership. And basically, thinking outside the box, they managed to deliver this through the logistics system of Coca-Cola. So yes, they're not giving you the Coca-Cola; they're giving you the pack. One example. Second story. UNHCR has been involved in putting up temporary structures for refugees. What they've been suffering is that these structures are fairly unstable, or at least they're not fit for use. So again, putting their heads together with the private sector partner IKEA, they're redesigning using IKEA knowledge of flat packing as well as being able to construct structures that may basically meet basic conditions of stability and moving on to basically this supposed to become available. Third story, I think most of you use WhatsApp. Most of us, almost everybody uses WhatsApp, partially to avoid charges, partially because instant messaging has become the wave. Guess what? In a country that's fairly large in terms of population, there is a competitor to WhatsApp. It's called WeChat. WeChat is a platform not only for instant messaging, but practically for any kind of commerce that you want to conduct in China. You can order pizza, you can seek employment, you can do your banking, and that has become a platform of choice because of what it affords and why a smartphone is practically in the hands of a lot more people than a bank branch, and or being able to order something through a landline. You can actually order the thing online, and of course the payment system has to go with it. So this combination has resulted for thinking a little bit, I'm dreaming with you a little bit. If we think outside the box, perhaps a version of WeChat can very well serve the refugee communities, going back to the notion of community, but designing something that works in a context of a particular refugee context, like for instance, we have here the Syrian refugees. It could very well be a solution, or at least the beginning of thinking outside the box. So I would like to leave you with those thoughts, and my colleague Randa will take it on from there.
So based on the above and what Bijan has just shared with us, we wonder, is there really a potential to pursue? So the question is, can organizations move from a frame of mind of temporary relief or opportunistic profit to social innovation and entrepreneurship? Innovation and entrepreneurship were very successful to identify problems and focus on them in a non-traditional way, avoiding the frames where institutional pathways have locked us. To illustrate, we are used to think that the UNHCR and NGOs will distribute aid. That aid consists of certain services, but can someone else do it? Can we provide aid in any other way? Thinking outside the box has the potential to yield results, and we have seen positive outcomes in the private sector in the case of incubators and accelerators, as they have the capacity to focus the energy of the private sector. So connecting back to the title of the conference and the title of our session, we want to share with you two of our ongoing research projects. These are obviously examples of research, of the research that can be done. So our first project explores the role of smartphones in the daily life of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. The second project evaluates the role of social innovation incubators and accelerators in alleviating the refugee crisis. And I will tell you more about this one. So in this project, we ask, can, and if yes, how, does the private sector, specifically incubators and accelerators in the humanitarian innovation ecosystem, help in resolving the refugee crisis? So we aim to identify the role of the private sector, understand how they promote cooperation in the ecosystem and how they lead to the development of this ecosystem. Finally, identify the learnings from the current experience to formulate recommendations to the ecosystem participants. So, Bijan, do you want to tell us a bit about the challenges we face in researching in such contexts?
I think we leave that to the questions to come up, but I think basically I'll give you one thought. 10 to 20% of the current what's called unicorns in the market. Unicorns are startups that have exceeded $1 billion valuation within 5 years. Worldwide, about 10 to 20% of these unicorns are products of accelerators, innovators. Airbnb, if any of you use it, is a product of an accelerator. So basically pushing that forward, getting it to commercialization. We think if that kind of, effort is applied to the problems of refugees, one has high potential to produce some usable outcomes. I leave it to that, and then we can have the discussion.
Do we have any questions from the panelists?
One of the things that I've noticed among my students is just a real zeal for social entrepreneurship. So I talk to so many students who have a personal interest in this area because of their values, but it's hard for them sometimes to see a path of how they get from their values to an actual successful enterprise. So how would you teach students, or how would you work with students that want to do this sort of activity?
One example that was conducted at AUB last year was the participation in the HALT Prize, which is the $1 million HALT competition, and the aim was to actually come up with a project that addressed a refugee, challenge, a refugee need. And there were about, I don't remember the exact number, about 60 teams, if I'm not mistaken, and they were coached by faculty throughout AUB. Some of the faculty were from the business school, others from public health, agriculture, education, depending on the interests and the needs and the ideas. And I think it was a very interesting and a challenging experience, but the students were very happy with it at the end.
I'd like to just maybe ask a question, a leading question. So what we see more and more in business schools, and many of you teach in business schools or have taught in business schools, is this integration of a social responsibility, not just in a CSR class, but throughout the curriculum on how to build social consciousness around these issues. So you're, Randa, talking about the HALT Prize as one key area of getting students to start, in particular business students and engineering students, to start thinking like the humanities students, thinking about social issues. And I'm wondering if any of you on the panel can think or can draw upon their own personal experience within the classroom where this has been the case beyond the HALT Prize.
So it's a very good point. I think from our perspective, at least in the business school, one of the key things, I run a class, which is an acceleration class, actually. It's an MBA core course, I think some of you know. It's called Practicum, Entrepreneurship Innovation Practicum. I co-teach it with people from private sector, actually. And one of the key things is that invariably one team usually has a social enterprise they want to accelerate. And it's very good, we welcome that. One of the key challenges we face with the students and otherwise is that because it's a social enterprise, people are not necessarily clued into the fact that it has to be sustainable and profitable. So, and that's the part that I think from the business school perspective, we have a duty to make sure that basically the people who are so keen on having social enterprise, the social enterprise is a goal, but the enterprise needs to be profitable. So therefore we need to work on how do you develop a value proposition, a business model, revenue stream, cost structure, resources, partners, etc. All the things that we do otherwise actually come into play here. And actually I think that's a very important role the business faculty as well as people connected to business can play, because that's the part that business has knowledge in. So social goals are critical, and then we marry the two with kind of concerns of business, that sustainability of the enterprise itself. So that's just one way I'm pointing out very specifically from my own experience. And we have had, in the language of entrepreneurship, you know, we call changing your business focus pivoting, meaning that, you know, Airbnb, if most of you know, was not originally the business it is. It was completely different business. They pivoted to offering what they offer. So these social enterprises have gone through our acceleration process, also have pivoted away to become much more sustainable. And I think that's the key that I can say we definitely have a role to play, and I think we owe it to everybody to do that.
So we have Jessica in the front telling us time is up. Thank you, Dr. Munla. I know that you took time to be with us today and you have to leave, so thank you for being with us. So I'm going to move to our next speaker, Mrs. Hoda Younan, who's a country manager and Lebanon and new markets manager for Microsoft.
So I'll drive it from here. You know, it's a dear tool to us. It's PowerPoint, so cannot do anything without it. Anyway, thank you for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here and to speak about a subject that is dear to all of us and that is touching our lives. And what I'll take you through is more a practical example of how, as Microsoft, we have tried to cope and to help on this crisis. It all starts, in fact. So it all starts with our mission. So our mission as Microsoft is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And the word planet it's not the word, it's the planet, because it's meant to be very inclusive, meaning it's not only about the people who have access to technology, it's about being inclusive in giving access to people who even do not have access to technology. And because we use technology to empower, and we know that technology has a big role to play in helping people in need. And this is what we based our efforts on. This is what we know what to do, in fact. So, and as we look how technology has been changing lately, it's been, everyone is calling it the fourth industrial revolution. And it's really, the evolution is so fast, and it's touching many points, like from let's say robotics to genomics to things like artificial intelligence, IoT, and cloud. But all of that is not important if really we don't move forward and give access to everyone. So technology is very important, but you cannot leave people behind. You cannot have people who are so advanced using those tools, but on the other hand, you have people who do not have access to technology. And we believe today that there are 4 billion people in the world with no access to the internet, with no access to 21st century skills that will allow them to be employed. And namely, refugees are part of these people because they, learning is not part of the priority they have. They are just striving to survive, and sometimes they forget that, time is passing, and they need to build for their future, because at a given time they will not be in that status, and they will wake up and find themselves not ready, neither to be employed, neither to have their own businesses. So this is what we thought of. And this is the motto of our philanthropies. In fact, it's driven by Microsoft Philanthropies. And we've been driving it mainly in our region, so in Turkey, in Jordan, and in Lebanon. So I will talk, these are the 4 pillars that we work on. I will mainly talk about the pillar of the displaced people, and that of the youth, definitely, and about the non-profit through whom we drive. So what we've been doing, first of all, it's divided to two focuses. So the first one is the humanitarian organizations, because today they are the ones reaching out to the displaced people or the refugees or the people in need. So we thought that the more we equip those NGOs with technology, we will help them do their business better. And by default, this is something we know how to do, meaning we're not reinventing. It can come from either employees volunteering or even through the software donations we provide to NGOs. So today we provide software donation to NGOs and special discount on accessing the cloud. And that will only empower them in supporting the people in need. In particular, the first responders, and we have an example where, for instance, in the refugee camps, they use Skype for Business, which was one of the products we provided them with to connect, because first of all, it's more reliable and it's more secure than using the phone in some of the cases on the camps that were on the frontiers. The second part of the support we give is to the displaced people themselves, but we have chosen as well capacity building and learning. So what we've done through NGOs as well, we agreed with them to equip or to train trainers that will be available in regional centers, and who train the refugees, the young people, the young refugees. And on top of that as well, we do organize things we call Hour of Code, where we initiate people our students, our young people in schools to code. And because the refugees attend today the public schools, so those refugees are part of that Hour of Code. So what we're doing is we're preparing these people to be employable. We're kind of making sure they are making good use of their time, and they're preparing themselves to, once they go back to their countries, they have good learnings. And here I have a practical example. So the story of Martina. Martina is an Iraqi refugee who's in Lebanon, but she didn't have any papers, any official papers. So she only had the papers that the UN gave her. And Martina joined that Train the Trainers, and she became a trainer. And today she is one of the best trainers who is training young Syrian refugees on. We have like 5 programs, from digital literacy to things that are more deep into technology. So this is, in brief, what we have practically done, and we are practically continuing to do. We would have loved to do a lot more, but we believe that this is something that where we differentiate, meaning this is something that we do that probably, and it's more sustainable than just helping with money or helping with food or helping with the survival. It's just something that is very is very positive and helping them look forward and give them motivation in building their future. So that's for my presentation, if you have any questions.
So do we have any questions from the panelists? I have one. Not from the audience yet. Sorry, we just got to give one time. Now I feel selfish that I'm going to ask my question. I'm sorry. So, quick question about the. So you're describing alignment with your core business and providing this to build capacity. And so I'm wondering, what sort of partners do you look for? Do you engage with in the landscape in providing these services? So you mentioned. One of the NGOs, are there other types of partners that you
It's mainly NGOs, because by default, and I think Harry would know, as a corporation, donations can only go through NGOs. Until now, these are our partners. But you know, there are many NGOs today, very active, and we are giving priority to those NGOs who are working on refugee crisis. In some of the cases, we didn't have any kind of partnership beyond or outside the NGOs.
So models of public-private partnership, and that's
we're struggling with technology. Not on this subject in particular, or nothing I'm aware of. Maybe it has happened in other countries, but not here. Anyway, on this in particular, public-private partnership is something that is longer term. So these steps that we have taken are practical steps. We've been working on these for the last 2 years. We have dedicated people for that. And on top of that, we have employee volunteering to either train and, the hour of code and things like that.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting, and it was interesting to see the alignment between what you're doing and the company's core mission. And as you know, in this area, one of the big challenges is measuring impact. So how do you know if you're making a difference? And you can tell that anecdotally, but can you tell us a little bit about sort of what data you use and track to determine if how the programs are successful and how they might need to be changed over time?
I wouldn't say that we're very advanced in building KPIs on beyond, for example, the number of people trained and kind of trying to reach out to rural areas and things like that. But we did not invest in building KPIs on, for example, accompanying or assessing the people what they could do with whatever we've given them, or kind of follow on their progress. Probably that would be an interesting thing, and that would be an interesting thing where we would need to partner beyond NGOs. We've partnered as well with international organizations. So I remember probably, and Nadim can remind me, we worked a little bit with UNHCR or partnered with them. But we didn't create that, unfortunately, but I believe if we want to complete that and to have it, I agree with you that we need to have the right KPIs in place and the right assessments, which we didn't do.
Yeah, and just to put in a pitch for exactly that sort of a thing, I can imagine this model being replicated in a lot of different contexts, and I think it would be really cool to track that longitudinal data, which really helps the company tell its story about what it's doing in this space, but then also I think gives you a roadmap for rolling this out in other places, and even for other companies that are contemplating similar sorts of things that are community-based interventions that align with their core missions.
I agree, and let's not forget, unfortunately, when you are a commercial company, you think always commercial. And let's not hide behind our fingers, meaning at the end, what we are doing is we are propagating the know-how on our technology, and at the end, those people who are learning the technology will use it someday, either to build their own meaning to be entrepreneurs, to build their own business, but as well to use it and kind of consume it in their life. So, but this is the way it is.
Thank you. So we need to move to our last speaker. I'm getting some signs from Mr. Yasser Akawi. He's the chairman of the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies and also the editor-in-chief of Executive, which is a regional publication that many of our business people in the room read regularly.
Thank you. Thank you. As part of civil society and media, we are always on the observation bench. And it breaks your heart. Of course, we wish we are as big as Microsoft, and we can integrate a human-centered mission and how we do business, improving humanity. But we always try to elevate the discussion whenever it comes to addressing the refugee crisis in Lebanon. And what we have struggled with, at least since 2011 until today, is how can we change the mindset or the perspective, the perception, or the problem-solving mindset from relief to development thinking, to development, to the development approach. And this is a huge challenge because, of course, we are also challenged by populist political discourse that is manipulating fear and manipulating economic principles for political ends. This is a new reality in our part of the world and the whole world, I guess, using a populist. The media also doesn't help much, also because they follow a populist discourse and, of course, manipulate, which makes policymakers or anybody that is trying to promote an inclusive versus an extractive economic model, or at least problem-solving reasoning, is basically immediately threatened. Yes, we have more than or around 500,000 Syrian refugees in the schooling age. They need education, they need water, they need sanitation, and they need healthcare. And yes, definitely huge investments need to be made, and definitely policy making needs to scratch their head using design thinking in order to come up with solutions. It's not by spending $1 billion in infrastructure, because this is by putting this solution forward is exactly the extractive model that has been used forever. How can we make money off the back of Syrian refugees? By spending $5 or $15 billion, which we know will be mismanaged, and corruption will make sure no refugee will get any of this money. So corruption remains a big issue in Lebanon. So we definitely don't want to go the path of spending $15 billion at 1.5% interest rate, which will be stolen again. $130 billion have been stolen the last 10 years. I don't know whether we want to see another additional debt on our back. So, but meanwhile, we have seen businesses that have been struggling with this exact model that exists. As a business and as a teacher, as an instructor of ethics at AUB, some of my best students are Syrian refugees. They graduate, they do their internships at Executive or at Capital Concept, and I want to retain them as employees. And unfortunately, once their residency stops as students, they have to go back home, and they cannot stay. This is pure stupidity. So even if we want to elevate it even higher, and maybe you can help me here, and think, okay, so we go to businesses and we tell them about the economic model, about Milton Friedman. We tell them about how you need to make profit by integrating a human-centered approach to problem solving. You have to not cause harm. You have to be responsible. You have to prevent harm, and you have to do good. Whether you can't do anything of that. Because if we think, if you want, from a pure business ethics perspective, how can you do any of those if you're breaking the law each time you make any of those? You cannot employ, you cannot give a loan to a Syrian refugee, you cannot open an account for a Syrian refugee, so forget about the banking industry. You cannot service them or even make any inclusive model that even would honor them as entrepreneurs. Even as entrepreneurs, we have so many talented Syrian refugees in Lebanon that have excellent education, engineers, they have beautiful ideas, and they cannot see them happen. Meanwhile, the media, I'm trying to mix everything together. Meanwhile, the media basically focuses on the competition of the Syrian refugees with their host communities, and how the wages have been decreasing and how unemployment is now above 30%. We talk about businesses that are going out of business because the Syrian businesses are opening next to them and they are competing with them, and this is so. Meanwhile, this is only indication of how the government in Lebanon, how the system in Lebanon is unable to identify or to devise national versus local authorities or local communities governance system that will allow design thinking on a community level as well as on a government level to come up with tailor-made solutions for their own regions. In a nutshell, refugees in Lebanon are in for a bad deal. And the thing is, that's what we think. Lebanon is in a bad deal altogether. Yesterday, it was released on several news channels that the economy in Turkey, at least a few cities around the border, has benefit of something like $360 million investment from Syrian refugees. In Lebanon, we were not able to attract their industrial acumen, and Syria was an industrial country, and they were able, and I know for sure, and I can say the name, the Attar family, that exported $4 billion worth of medicine because they had the Roche brand and they used to produce it, came to the Lebanese government and asked them to give them a basket of incentives so that they can open their manufacturing facilities here. And the Lebanese government was more busy trying to see how they can steal the money rather than open and create jobs for Lebanese and non-Lebanese. Thank you.
From the panel, questions from the panel. And then the audience, because I can feel the energy there.
Well, thank you for that. There was a lot in your presentation, and certainly a lot about the local context. So I'm going to try to ask a broader question. One of the real challenges in teaching business ethics or corporate social responsibility is to think about the relationship between the institution of business and the institution of government. So in the area of human rights, where I do a lot of my research, this is the fundamental question. Human rights are duties of states, protecting human rights, but businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights. Now, this has come under a lot of criticism because in a lot of places, you have businesses playing a quasi-state sort of role. So in near-failing states, businesses essentially play a governmental type role. So with regard to refugees generally or the Lebanese context, what do you think the institution of business ought to be doing as the institution of business?
Okay. So we just launched, in addition to our governance methodologies, we just launched an ENS methodology. And we started helping Lebanese corporates who are trying to improve the respect of the environment and the society and community. And then you always fall in that question, and you always have in these big meetings somebody with that big smile, and he goes, okay, environment, we were able to do the recycling. to use to discern between the green and the yellow and the blue. So what do we do with that now? If Lebanon is drowning in garbage, so what? So one bank, for example, or one company that is able to collect, and we did it at Executive, and I have a witness here, Mr. Thomas Shalom, who basically, we ended up with a bag or several bags filled with beer bottles after our Friday. So where do you go with it? And even if you dispose of it anywhere, how do you know it won't end up in another pile of an open dump? The tripartite relationship between corporate, government, and society, if one of them is dysfunctional, the whole system is dysfunctional. Otherwise, it would become really prohibitive for every company to own its own program that is and commit to best-in-class practices. In other words, it means that I have to create my own incinerator, environment-friendly, of course, incinerator, in order to burn my own glass, or do my own paper recycling. Unless there's a real government solution for that, I mean, it becomes very prohibitive and very difficult and very expensive.
Well, as a follow-up, it sounds like you have really awesome parties, so maybe I can talk to you afterwards about those. But do you have any hope that things are going to improve, which is a difficult question to ask, given the past week, and what do you think would drive improvement in these relationships?
I mean, we cannot give up. I mean, whether you're involved in human rights, and of course, you can share with us your own experience, it doesn't happen overnight. Once you committed to change, it's a continuous fight. You have to be committed to it, and you always have to hope for the best. And it's cyclical. Sometimes you feel change can happen fast. Let's say, I can at least say from LCPS, in a very short period of time, we were able to push the decentralization law forward, the access to information law forward. We even, a couple of years before that, we were able to get a minister, Ziad Baroud, to become a minister who belongs to the school of LCPS. So sometimes you have fast wins, and sometimes you have to be very patient until you can, but you can't stop. You just keep on trying. At the end, either you can stand the heat or you get out of the kitchen. Okay, so that's the idea.
Okay, so we can now turn to the audience for any questions to any of the panelists or all of the panelists.
Hi, Arto Sarkisian. I'm a business consultant. I'm from Syria. So I have some information that could be useful, that reconstruction has started. How would you think that the academic institutions could put and spot some light on it? Of course, this would help, of course, the refugee problem, because they would find it more attractive to go back and maybe go with the business that work inside here, or a Lebanese business could go there and start a business, and they will take with them some Syrian refugees, and maybe they would go by themselves. Thank you. The universities do research to help and to put some light on the issue?
That's a great question. So we had a family business symposium about 3 weeks ago here, and one of the families that we had on the panel was Syrian family who moved to Lebanon during the nationalization period, but they have very tight connections, the Al-Baki group, tight connections to Syria, manufacturing plants were in Syria, And one of the things that came up during the panel discussion was the ability of these businesses, but also more generally from the region, because we are a conflict-ridden region, is that these businesses are able to improvise and deal with the uncertainty caused by war, by displacement, by sudden economic death of various kinds. So, and really, we owe it to them to research this. And I know my colleague, Ramzi Fatallah, is working on also a similar topic. He and I both have worked more or less on this, trying to figure out what we can shed light on. So what we have come up with a notion of what we call Phoenix entrepreneurship, which is you kind of face, one of his quotes, one of his papers says, you go from hero to zero, if very fast, and from zero to Phoenix also very fast. So this research topic is not done in the West, and this is something that we have both the ability but also the know-how to focus on and highlight the process, and I think it really could help shed more light in what you're talking about. So I think we are on the beginning of the stages doing this, but I think it's important, could make a contribution.
I think that, if I could answer as well, there's quite a bit of research being done at the business school, or at least starting at the business school, around refugee and the refugee crisis. One example that I can give, myself and my colleague Fida Afuni here at the business school have a special issue coming out, or call for papers coming out on the career ecosystem of refugees and what that means and what does it look like, both in terms of informal career ecosystems and how businesses and private sector can contribute or not contribute to that, how it's a threat or not a threat. But beginning to think about the ecosystem of career, or the ecosystem of beyond just job, but also creating a sustainable forms, and whether that's informal or not. So that's one area that I've been working on in terms of research. Any other additions here around the research? No? Other questions?
Thank you to all the panelists for the discussion. So on the topic of careers and thinking of social innovation and creative ways around the legal, let's say, barriers for employment for refugees, I'm wondering what kind of projects from the private sector can support the skills and talents of refugee youth and children through arts and music, and using innovative ways with social media, with technology, all the things that were mentioned in the presentation, and how this can kind of be a way to navigate around the legal barriers by taking advantage of social media and technology and the existing skills and talents of refugees, particularly in areas like music and arts, where you can promote their music, let's say, online and generate some sort of income with the support, I guess, of the technology that we have available today. Thank you.
There is a project. The name of the project is just slipping my mind. I'm trying to really remember, but I can't. That is exactly built in the way that you're describing. So there's an online platform, and basically it's open to anyone, including, of course, Syrian refugees in general, and they have been, members, participants in this network basically record their music, upload it to this platform, and sell it. So this is a project that does exist. Unless I misunderstood your question.
Yeah, it's, I'm gonna answer a question that you asked, Hoda, about how we measure our KPIs. We are working in Microsoft Corp now, we are working in creating a tool that will allow the NGO access this tool, and every time a trainer complete a training, they will access the tool, complete a form, and submit the topic that he covered, and at the end of the day, each student will have a certificate that is signed by Microsoft and by the student. Therefore, we can tell that behind these 100 instructors that we trained, how many Syrian refugees has benefit from the 5 pillars that we selected, and how these 5 pillars, there's a questionnaire, how these 5 pillars will help them go back home and rebuild Syria with everything that they learned.
Yeah, and thank you for that clarification. I think it's important to note that when we think about impact assessment, it's got to be done in a way that's really easy for folks. If it's complicated, people aren't going to participate in it, and it sounds like that's a very simple way of gathering a lot of data that would then be useful for you in evaluating the success of the program.
So just a comment on measuring the corporate's social value. You can do it by using some techniques for measuring your social return on investment. So basically, as you said, that you are a for-profit company, and in the end, you need to measure this just as measuring your ROI. So in this way, you can also measure your social impact or value on society. That's one. 2, my question to you was, which NGOs or civil society organizations is Microsoft working with in Lebanon, or your partners?
Many of them, meaning the number, Nadim, but I would think the number of NGOs that we are working with today would be...
With more than 10 NGOs in Lebanon, like 10 big NGOs, but on the software donation, every eligible NGO is eligible to benefit from our donation.
So I'll give you the example on the example I gave on training the trainers. This is with Arc-en-Ciel. That is the one where we're using Arc-en-Ciel to go there. But today, any NGO, and this is a call if any NGO is present here, any NGO has the right to get this donation. Definitely, they are vetted, so they enter and they. But any NGO has the right to get access to the cloud and software donations. Some are for free, simply. And some are for a very reduced price. So it's a call as well if among you any NGO exists. So number of NGOs that we've worked with, I don't know, meaning the number exactly, but I know that we're talking about above 50 probably, as many NGOs as you have. Those are benefiting from the software donation and from the support. But for this program in particular, meaning training the trainer, it was with Arc-en-Ciel.
Yes, just as a follow-up to the previous question, because I just dig the file out, the name of the NGO or the name of the project is Mishwar Amal, Journeys of Hope, and the website is mishwar.org. And basically what they do is... Oh, okay. So basically for whoever doesn't know Mishwar, they reinvest the proceeds of the sales in the community. I hope I'm right on what you're doing. Okay.
Hello. Yeah. So how do you, question is for everyone basically. So how do you ramp up the efforts of a ticking the box exercise, which I don't want to accuse that this is the kind of exercise that you guys are doing, but it is still in its infancy stage. So I can see it is the case in my opinion. So how do you ramp up the scale considering we have 2 million refugees in Lebanon, and basically tie it up with government efforts and business efforts to use the technologies that you started your presentations with, and not only giving certifications and trainings to people who might not be, first of all, use it or maybe use it at home. The scale is really high, and I think the area of where all these three parties can work together, assuming a non-corrupt government or quasi-corrupt government, is to look at the initiatives that a country might have to do and use that huge labor force that they have, using the technology that you talked about in the beginning, like genomics or whatever, artificial intelligence or like massive kind of technologies, to maybe, for example, from a business point of view, you can get a tax benefit through a government, because in the way it is now, there's a lot of assumptions in what you guys are doing, a lot of idealistic assumptions, and I think from a profit point of view, considering we all in a business school here, there's a lot of work that can be done in how to basically make it a massive kind of a project, working with governments, working with technologies, and looking at what a country such as Lebanon has to do and has to look at the treaties that we have to abide by a certain period of time, and trying to allocate resources to combine all of these efforts together. Otherwise, in my opinion, I see it remaining in the way it is. Thank you.
I'll answer you. You know, in such projects, you have to look for things where you can drive impact. And unfortunately, partnering with the government in Lebanon is something that should be very long-term, and it cannot drive impact. So this is why, on this in particular, although I agree with you that technology can be a big driver and a big help and whatever, but you have to take those paths that will lead you to a result. And from experience, because from a business point of view, it's very hard to drive business with the government in Lebanon. We have to admit that for many reasons. This is why we choose the way that would show impact and would bring result. I'm not saying that what we're doing is the most impactful. We have lots of ambitions in that, but this is something that we could achieve and we could finish, meaning it's a task that you could finish. If you open a task with the government, you're going into other challenges that are not that easy today. So this is our point of view, but I believe probably others do try to cooperate with governments.
More related to where does the government need you instead of you needing them? Look at the area that the governments need you with such a big corporation such as Microsoft, with the technologies that you have, and they have treaties that they need to abide by and accomplish by a certain period of time that can only be done through the likes of Google, Microsoft, or whoever. So how can you basically leverage on that need as opposed to going to the government, let the government come to you? That was my question.
If you have a way to convince them...
No, it's just food for thought,
Yeah, unfortunately it's not the case. Unfortunately, technology is not a
priority of our government today. I believe they have many problems that they have to prioritize before thinking of innovating and using innovation. We try. I'm not saying we're not doing anything. So on the education level, we are doing a lot because we're driving a lot with public schools and with the Ministry of Education, Higher Education, because it's on youth, because it's easy to execute. But in general, I agree with you, but unfortunately, it's not happening. The dynamics is not there.
Yeah, you referred to checking the box, and that's a very, very tough issue when you think about any domain of business ethics or corporate social responsibility. I'm finishing a paper with a couple of colleagues now where we're looking at due diligence processes for human trafficking. So very, very tough issue, and we're contrasting what we call plausible deniability, which is the checkbox approach, with ethical commitment. So that, and then that really feeds into the processes by which a company engages in due diligence. The problem is that ethical commitment for a company is like ethical commitment for an individual. It's hidden because it's really related to motivation, it's related to organizational culture. So I guess what I would say to that question is it's an important question. It's a question that folks in business ethics research are thinking about all the time. And part of the solution to that, I think, is for stakeholders and for civil society to continue to press companies to make progress on these sorts of issues. Because ultimately, the argument that I would make is that what brings about ethical commitment is a culture in the organization in which these things are embedded, which makes it unthinkable that you don't do them.
Just quickly, I would like to also address perhaps from a different perspective what you asked, because I think implicit in what you ask is you want it fast, you want to scale fast response. Okay, that too. So one of the key things I think the business, again, knowledge brings to this is that scaling any effort takes time. There is research documents, companies that have scaled successfully their operations anywhere from 15 to 25 years. Let's say we want to go to the lower end of that. So I think scaling is something you need to build up. And I think that one of the implicit assumptions of this problem is that this problem is going to disappear fast. Actually, I think I agree with some of the underlying assumptions that Yasser talked about, where the Syrian refugee problem is going to be with us. So we have to start thinking long term and more or less putting in place things that would help solve this problem rather than quick fixes. And then those things actually would help the process, and think about the way Nadim was talking about also, that it's kind of make it win-win. Thinking like that points to both working on two fronts. Low-lying fruits that you can get, but also long-term reforms of things like work permits. Why not give them work permits and then tax their income? I mean, it's like, I feel like that's, these are things that, again, a discourse has to change. That discourse changes, then we start working. And the worst thing we can do is, oh, if we solve this tomorrow morning. We can't solve this tomorrow morning. We have to work on many fronts. And unfortunately, is one of those intractable problems that's like that.
Again, an observation. Again, this tripartite relationship, and here I'm referring to an article written by Robert Kaplan in 1997. It's called Was Democracy Just a Moment? And which explains, it's a very interesting article for those, it was published in The Atlantic, I think. The Atlantic, right? Yeah, and that describes very well what's happening today, where governments are more busy with a very populist discourse, manipulating the unemployed, the uneducated, the underprivileged, and to get to power, which basically the Trump and other than Trump. And you have corporates, and people who more refer to corporates like Microsoft. And we live through Microsoft and through Microsoft products. And we get separated and removed from our immediate community. And somehow there's even a bigger parallel community that is educated, professional, that interacts through social media, and that lives in an augmented reality through screens. And that is basically killing our appetite to relate to our immediate community. So also we have to observe this, which is affecting also this tripartite relationship between government, society, and businesses. Businesses today is irrelevant where they are. Microsoft, of course, we're very happy to have Hoda and Nadim here in Lebanon. But today you can, with the cloud computing that Microsoft has put forward and all their software, they don't need to be here. They can be living anywhere. So this also defies our perception of this tripartite relationship.
Okay. I'm not sure if this question was addressed earlier in the conference, but I just got in this afternoon for the And I don't know if any of you are in position to answer it, but since we're at an Institute for Public Policy, and you've touched on the issue of the policy that restricts businesses from being able to tap into the human capital of refugees, that they're restricted to, you said, agriculture, construction, and sanitation. So is there an effort from SM Faris Institute for Public Policy or from AUB generally to lobby for a change in that policy? Why or why not?
I've been told to do this. On this panel, we don't have a representative from the ISAM Affairs Institute currently. So does anybody else I mean, we do have perspective on this as business scholars and practitioners. So Harry?
Well, I'm leaving tomorrow, so I can say whatever I want on this particular issue. So in for a penny, in for a pound. It's a very, very delicate question here, and I think you're right to point out that the way we would talk about these issues in the United States, a country of 330 million people that's accepting 45,000 refugees this year, has to be different from the way Germany would think about them, would have to be different from the way that Lebanon is thinking about them. So I don't know enough to really offer an opinion that would be informed by research. I have feelings on that particular topic, but if there's anything that I've learned in talking to people on the refugee issue here is just how complicated it is and how it ties into a lot of other issues related to cultural and political and religious balance. So rather than say something uninformed, to say I empathize with that question, and it really strikes me that these are very, very difficult challenges in Lebanon.
Let me add something practical. Even if anyone comes with a proposal of changing the policy, it has to go to the parliament to be approved. Thus, it has to be approved from a political point of view, and I don't think that is an easy job, meaning even if they have all the willingness to do it, I'm not sure about its feasibility, unfortunately.
Can you hear me? So, to flip this around, so now we're talking about corporate responsibility, corporations giving donations, corporations helping out. Why not corporations start paying minimum wage, start paying health care, start avoiding taxes, because then the governments have enough revenue to provide services in the first place. This whole discussion needs to be flipped around a little bit. I think it's okay to give 1% of your profits or whatever, but how are the profits made? I think a lot of what we see is a problem with business being done wrong, business being done without values. So the values are not just for the CSR part of it, values are for how business is being done in the first place. So that's my little...
So thank you for that. I think perhaps you may have missed the beginning where we were, so we clearly, in framing this session, we're quite careful and cautious to speak very outwardly and overtly about the skepticism of business's role, particularly within neoliberal market economics and the role that we've played over. So we acknowledge that quite, and we were very careful not to tread within the water of solely CSR and the marketing aspects and greenwashing. So, thank you for your apology. I think that we're running out of time. Harry, did you want to say something before?
Yeah, I would just to affirm that particular comment. One of the real challenges in my field of business ethics and corporate social responsibility is to think about what's a public policy issue, what's a corporate responsibility issue, and where there is overlap. So when it comes to employment and it comes to refugee issues, there's a role for philanthropy, but as I mentioned in my comments, what really matters is what companies do in their day-to-day activities, interacting with employees and stakeholders, and refugees, so on and so forth. And then you bring up the tax issue, and that is obviously gotten a lot of attention for a whole host of reasons, and that certainly is an area where there's a lot of overlap between public policy and CSR, and there's no simple answer to that question.
So I think to wrap up, Bijan, did you want to say something? No, please go ahead.
I would like to also mention, I saw very recently a documentary that's 2 years old, I think. It's called The Ghost of Steve Jobs in Apple. I forgot something like it. It's a very interesting play on the historically what Apple has done and how a lot of it has not been, let's say, local version of kosher is called halal. So it's not halal business-wise. So what am I trying to point out? Is that a lot of people buy, I mean, this responsibility is everywhere. It's not just government, it's business. A lot of people shell out $800 for Apple iPhone. But they don't think about what Apple is doing internally. So, because Apple is cool. So I think what you're pointing out is across the board. You know, it's not just to business. All of us are responsible in a way that, you know, we are fascinated and sometimes seduced by products on the market. So therefore, I just want to also extend that, if it's possible, to consumers as well, not just to government.
Yeah, governments is a good one, particularly in our context. But to wrap up just very quickly, I think that there was a lot of work that went into creating and continuing to create a dialogue within business scholarship and within private sector to provide a space or a voice for those within this context that want to partner with IR, with humanitarian scholars. And it's a difficult road within the context of neoliberal market economics, and I think this is very much recognized. But that's to ask the question to the audience then, do we sideline and keep people such as our panelists, our esteemed panelists, do we keep them away from partnering with us on the work that we do within the crisis? And this, I think, asks a broader question is, what are the potential mechanisms through which then we can govern private enterprises in focusing, as the panelists, I think, have tried to point out, on specific problems, on specific projects in particular contexts? So I think the question that we are asking, or most of us are proposing, are not at the macro societal levels. They are about how can you, in this audience, in the questions we're asking over the next 2 days, partner with businesses to make the jobs that we're doing in NGOs, INGOs, governance, and so on, easier, perhaps more strategic. So here we bring up and we think about issues about innovation partnerships, we think about cross-sectorial possibilities, we think about how do we tap into the core businesses of various businesses, the core skills, how do we bring about core alignment, how do we partner with businesses to allow access for other technologies that perhaps otherwise we wouldn't have, how do we devise strategies or use businesses and their expertise on efficiencies and building effective strategies, how do we help this in the way that we respond to the crisis? I think also to draw upon, we have some of the examples given by Bijan and Randa, the low-lying fruit moving forward in part of our response, but also thinking about this in the longer-term solutions as the other speakers have thought about. And I think I just want to end to say that we've been, there is the idea that businesses, there's a threat in working with business, and back to the original cartoon that I put up when I talked about it. But I also think that there is an opportunity here to partner with the business school, with the private sector, and we welcome these partnerships from the various disciplines here in the room. So thank you for that, and thank you for attending.